Angolans are waiting for their national election results. Current President João Lourenço is contending against main opposition leader of UNITA, that's Alberto Costas Jr. A couple of surveys conducted before the election suggest that the UNITA candidate is ahead. What makes this interesting is that if Costas Jr.'s party is victorious, Angola could be led by country's second largest political party in Angola. Founded in 1966, UNITA fought alongside MPLA, that was in Angola, in the Angolan War, for liberation between 1961 to 1975. It then fought against MPLA in a civil war that lasted decades. To dissect this, I'm joined by Analyst at African-Asia Dialogues, that's Ayesha Kajee. Ayesha, good morning and thank you very much for your time. You know, whatever the outcome of these elections, they were by far the toughest for the long-ruling Liberation Party since multi-party democracy actually arrived back in 1992. But I must say this is a phenomenon experienced by many liberation movements on the continent right now, with the overwhelming youth populace reluctant to pledge allegiance to liberation movements. Just take us through the Angola socio-political dynamics that have brought the MPLA to this particular point.
Well, the MPLA has steadily been losing voter support in the past 4 elections. So since, coming into power at the end of the Civil War in 2002, the MPLA has gone from, in the last election, from about 70 or more than 70% voter support to only about 61% in the last election. And in fact, they were below 50% in the capital, Luanda, which is an MPLA heartland, and it would have been anathema, almost unthinkable for Luandans to not vote for the MPLA 20 years ago. That alone gives you a big indicator of where the MPLA's popularity is going and how the opposition's popularity has been growing in response. Remember that more than 60% of Angolans are actually under the age of 25. So, a historical to them conflict between the MPLA and UNITA holds no water any longer. And many young people are now very pro-opposition, pro-UNITA in many cases, but also pro some of the other smaller opposition parties, which of course don't really have much of a chance in this election.
And that's the very scary part, that if we speak of the identity of UNITA, it's essentially a rebel group turned opposition, 27 years of civil war between MPLA and UNITA. But it seems that the youth could care very little about history. They're only looking to their future. So what does this say about the politics on the continent currently? Because one could argue that this is something even South Africa can learn from, that liberation movements betray those that they've liberated so much, and it becomes a graver offense that they could find themselves even going back to a former oppressor who has refined themselves, perhaps learning from the mistakes of the liberator.
Absolutely. When liberation movements become political parties, they forget that the loyalties that underpin them as liberation movements, as those who have opposed oppression, discrimination, apartheid, etc., they forget that that legacy isn't going to last forever. And if they don't live up to their promises of a better life for their citizens, that ultimately they're going to come to a stage, as Angola has now, where young people who don't have an internalization of that conflict history are ready to vote for the opposition. Of course, having said that, one also needs to realize that Angola particularly is a very oil-rich country, and it has been very corrupt in terms of governance for very, very long. So even the middle class, which initially benefited from that corruption, that nepotism, etc., is now turning against the MPLA. However, as I said, it's all pretty much a moot point at this point because the Electoral Commission and the media is dominated by the MPLA. We've seen in past elections that the Electoral Commission is largely made up of appointees of the MPLA and the government. And so it's likely that vote counting, despite the election being very tight this time around, it's likely that in that vote counting process, the MPLA will come out victorious. They've also received a far greater share of media coverage, as has happened in previous elections. There has been a case filed by UNITA in this regard. What the outcome of that will be, we can't say yet. So if this were a free and fair election, is what I'm saying, it's quite likely that UNITA would win. However, given that it's not a free and fair election by any means, in terms of the rigging of the Electoral Commission and the possibilities for rigging the election overall, it's likely that the MPLA will win, but with a far smaller majority. Now, the object lesson here for liberation movements turned political parties across the continent and including South Africa is they really need to get their act in gear. They really need to divert some of the funds from the resources of the country, in Angola's case oil, in South Africa's case gold, platinum, etc., to actually truly improving the lives of the most vulnerable and marginalized. In Angola, poverty is above 50%, and you can therefore understand why the frustrations are so high. If these liberation movements don't learn this lesson, they are going to eventually get voted out of power.
It's honestly heartbreaking because, I mean, they're second largest oil producer on the continent, but then you have half of the youth. When you speak of the 60% being under 25 and then half of those being unemployed, they really do feel betrayed. But are you not worried about political instability beyond the results now? Because you had this enthusiastic youth that was going out to vote. We saw it on social media. They wanted to see the change. What happens post these results?
If the results favor the MPLA, as I expect they will, I expect there will be widespread protest in the urban areas at least, and in UNITA strongholds. Should that happen, of course, there runs the result then of increasing post-election violence. However, given that the military in Angola is very pro-MPLA and has actually reacted brutally against protesters in recent years, for example, the protests around the economy 2 years ago was met with live ammunition from the military. So it's likely that any protest will be quickly suppressed by the military. There was protest last year in Cabinda in the north of Angola, again suppressed by the military. It's a heavily militarized society. So it's very likely that there will be protests, but they will be suppressed by the military. If, however, there's a surprise victory for UNITA, which frankly, given the composition of the Electoral Commission, I don't expect. But if there were to be that surprise victory for UNITA, there would be regional and international repercussions, given that the MPLA has traditionally been very close to Moscow, has traditionally been very close to other ruling parties in the region, such as the ANC here in South Africa. And so those dynamics of relationships in the region, trans-country relationships, inter-country relationships, as well as internationally, will be renegotiated quite carefully should UNITA come in with a surprise win, which, as I said, I think is unlikely at this point.
Ayesha, you know, you paint a picture of a country or an MPLA that's not willing to change. But then what do you make of João Lourenço's efforts? Because he really did try. Many said he really did try to root out corruption. I mean, he attempted to crumble the Dos Santos empire, honestly speaking. I mean, Dos Santos for the longest time now is not being repatriated. He's only just come back. So would that not work in his favor or indicate that there are winds of change that are blowing?
Post the 2017 election, there was a real optimism that Lourenço was bringing in change. He was sort of really acting against corruption, etc. But in the last 3 years, that has fizzled to a large extent. And the reason it has fizzled is triple. It's because in Angola, the nexus of political, economic, and very importantly, military power is all pro-MPLA. So I spoke just now about the middle class who have suffered under COVID and now under the war in Eastern Europe, etc., with food prices soaring and oil prices once again soaring, etc. So what you've got is a very tightly woven web in Angola of political interests, economic interests, and then military interests. And it's the military interests and the economic interests that are really preventing deep change in the systemic corruption that is so much a part of Angolan governance and Angolan life. Indeed. It's a similar situation in some respects to what one sees in a country like Egypt. And God forbid, it's a similar situation to what we are heading towards here in South Africa, with that web of corruption being so enmeshed in the economics and the politics and the security services within the country.
Ayesha, thank you very much, though, for your insights. That's analyst at African Asia Dialogues, Ayesha Kajee. More news on